Hey Techno Studs, now that we've learned about port security and how it can mitigate against some different types of attacks, let's learn how to configure port security on our different ports. When it comes to port security, there's actually a lot of different options that we have. And since there's so many options, there's a lot of different ways we can configure this. So let's cover what those options are, what the defaults are set to, and let's cover a few different ways we could set up our ports. So first of all, one thing that we can set on here is the number of MAC address. If we don't set the number of MAC addresses, then the default is 1 and will only allow 1 MAC address. Otherwise, we could set up multiple on here. The next is, how do we want it to learn of those MAC addresses? We could set it up so it manually learns it, where we type it in there, and so then it's in the configuration. We could set up where it dynamically learns it, which is the default. So if we don't do anything, it's just going to dynamically learn. Or we can set it up to be sticky. So once it learns, that actually enters it into the running config. And if you were to save that running config, it would go into the startup config. Then we can set up aging on this. How long are these MAC addresses going to stay in the system? If we set a time on there, then it will, and that's in minutes, it will go for that many minutes, and then it ages out that MAC address, and that MAC address will need to be relearned on that interface. The default for that is 0. When you have a 0 minute, that is essentially telling the machine that we don't want aging on, which that is the default on here. So if we don't set any time, the time is 0, which means that it doesn't age out the MAC addresses at all. We can set it up if we want aging of the static addresses. That is the addresses we manually set up. We can set it up for that. And we can also set up the type of aging that we want. And the default is absolute, which means that the aging timer, how long that MAC address is going to stay in the system, is going to start from the time that that MAC address first communicates on that port. And then the timer starts. Once the timer is up, it'll expire that MAC address, and then another device can take its place. All right, if we set it for inactive, then that means that it's going to maintain that in the MAC address. It's going to retain that MAC address for the time since the last time that MAC address communicated on the port. So absolute is from the time that you plug in the port and that MAC address communicates. The inactive was from the last time that MAC address communicated. And then we have violation. What's going to happen if the rules are violated? And we can shut down the port, which is by default. We can restrict or protect. The shut down means that we'd have to manually go and intervene, have to do something. I'm not a big fan of that because then it takes up a lot of my time, but that is what the default is. The restrict would shut down the port, and then once it's back into communication into the proper number of MAC addresses, then it will turn that port back on. Versus protect, then we'll just, if there's 5 MAC addresses that are allowed on this port, the 6th one and 7th one and 8th one will not be able to communicate until the aging timer expires on the initial 5. All right, so let's look at a few different configurations here. I'm going to get into the global configuration mode. The first one I'm going to do is just interface FA05, and I want just to turn on port security. So I'm going to turn it on. So now the question is how is that port going to respond? So the first question is, I have for you, go ahead and answer this, is how many MAC addresses can I have on FA05 at any given time? Now, if you answered 1, you would be correct because 1 is the default. The next is, how does it learn of the MAC addresses? And the answer is, it would learn it dynamically. what would be the aging time? How long would that MAC address, once learned, stay on the system? As long as the system is up and running, it's going to continue to keep that, and it will not release that MAC address. And so the default time is 0. That timing age starts from the time it first sees the communication because it's absolute. Although since the default is 0, it really doesn't, that doesn't take effect at this point in time. And then the violation, what happens if it goes above that one MAC address, then the violation type is shut down. So then it will go into error disabled. So that's how you read that. All right, so next, all of the same is going to be true for FA06, except for we're allowing an additional MAC address on that machine. So now it is able to have 2 MAC addresses on that machine. All right, so let's do 07. This time, I'm just manually creating another MAC address on here. So the first MAC address is taken with this A4:4C:C8. So that's the MAC address of that machine, which actually happens to be the MAC address of this machine. So if I were to open up a command prompt and I do ipconfig/all, I could scroll through here. What I'm looking for is not the Wi-Fi connection, because that's going to have a different MAC address, but the one right here. So A4:4C:C8. That's the one right there. So I've configured it on this device. So now my computer can connect to this port, and then it would allow one other computer to connect to this port. All right, next I'm going to do FA08 and FA08. I'm changing that. I already mentioned I'm not a big fan of the shutdown, because then once something has been violated, then I have to manually go in there, shut down the port, and then bring it back up to correct it. So there's a lot of manual intervention on my side to correct the issue. I don't want that, and so I can choose protect instead. Now what's going to happen is my 2 devices can connect to this port because I got a maximum of 2. And the third one or fourth one is not going to be able to connect until those initial 2 age out. But because the default for this is set to 0 for aging, they'll never time out, so no other machine will ever be able to connect once the initial 2 are taken up. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to do FA09. So the difference with this one is the MAC addresses are sticky, which means that those MAC addresses go into the running configuration. If I wanted to then save that running configuration, it would go into the startup configuration. So this would be where I really want things to be very static on my network and not really change. Okay, how about interface FA010? So in this case right here, I've got 2 MAC addresses that are able to connect to this. They can be on there for 120 minutes. The question for you is, what would be that 120 minutes from? From the time the switch first sees the MAC address, or from the time the MAC address last communicated? If you answered from the time that switch first sees the MAC address, you'd be correct because that is the default. It's set to absolute. All right, so let's take a look at FA011. This is the same thing, except in this case, I have my MAC address statically assigned on this interface. So that's what's going to be in the running config at this point in time. And this second MAC address then will expire after 120 minutes. All right, next I'm going to copy this one, and now I have 2 MAC addresses can connect to this port. They'll last 120 minutes, and that is from the time that those MAC addresses last communicated. Okay, and finally, this is the one I'm going to paste on interface 034 because that's the one that my laptop is on right here. And what it's going to do is this would be the more standard interface that I would probably have on my network. It guards against those attacks we've already talked about, but it also allows me to not have to do any kind of crazy administration to this network. So it's not super secure, but it's secure enough where it's going to mitigate against a lot of the attacks we talked about. So in this case right here, I turned switchport security on. So I turned it on. I'm going to have a maximum of 2, and I might set that for 3, 4, or 5. In fact, if this was in a conference room, I'd probably assign a few more to it because I don't want a time when somebody connects in and it's not able to connect. But even if I set this for 5, then for the most part, it's going to stop those attacks from happening that we talked about. All right, so I'm going to say switch port security aging 120. So I've set 120 minutes as being the timeout timer for this. Once again, if this was a conference room, I would probably set it for less. I'd probably set it for maybe like 30 minutes. I figure a short meeting would be about 30 minutes. And so maybe I would set this for 30 minutes on here. And then I'm going to do the aging, and maybe I set the type to be inactivity. So it stops from the timer is going from the time it last communicated on the network, and then switch port security violation protect. So those are some of the settings that I would probably set on a lot of my switches to protect against a lot of these attacks, but still not sink a bunch of my time into managing this network. So a couple commands to note here just to view what's happening on my switch. I'm going to do a show switch, or let's do show port security interface, and then FA 034. I can take a look at that and see now what the actual end effect is on this port. So it is enabled. That was that first command I entered in. It is, right now, it's secure up. Violation mode is protect. The aging time is 120 minutes. It's set for the inactivity. And so there we see one of the MAC addresses in here. Maximum number of MAC addresses is 2, although I only have 1 that's taken up right now. So there's that. And then I can do a show port security do address. And we can see it's not a crazy, I've only put this on a few of the ports, and I only have really a device connected into one port, and that's 034. So you can see that this was dynamically learned. So this one was dynamically learned. I didn't manually configure it. Versus FA07, I did manually configure that one right there. All right, and last one, I'm going to do a show port security. And now we can see which of these devices, these are the action is going to be taken for. Most of these is going to be shut down because that's the default. I put a couple of them into protect, and how many addresses are taken up. I've taken up this one here because that one was manually entered in, and I've taken up one here because that was dynamically learned. So there you have it. There is port security and how to protect against things like the DHCP starvation, or where an attacker is going to putting a lot of MAC addresses out on this network.